Jake leaned back on his porch, sipping sweet tea as the warm afternoon breeze rolled across his ranch. His land stretched far and wide, a peaceful retreat from the city chaos he'd left behind. Horses roamed lazily in the pasture, and the sound of wind chimes played against the rustling of old oak trees. This was the life he had worked for, simple, quiet, and free. That was until the HOA decided to meddle in his business. He wasn't even supposed to be part of the HOA. His ranch had existed long before they slapped together a fancy suburban neighborhood half a mile down the road. But somehow, thanks to some technicality, his land had been roped into their jurisdiction. He hadn't cared much before, let them bicker about lawn decorations and mailbox colors. It didn't affect him. That changed when he received the letter. A bright white envelope with the HOA's golden embossed logo, sealed with unnecessary formality. Inside was a notice stating that his clothesline was a violation of neighborhood standards. Apparently, his freshly washed work shirts and bedsheets flapping in the wind were an unsightly nuisance that ruined the community's aesthetic. Jake chuckled at the absurdity. His nearest neighbor was acres away, who exactly was being offended by his laundry. He shrugged it off at first, but then the fines started rolling in. $50, $100, $200, all for daring to let his clothes dry in the sun. His annoyance turned to disbelief when he saw the HOA president herself, Margaret Simmons, the self-proclaimed queen of suburban perfection, standing at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand. She was the embodiment of every HOA horror story: stiff posture, a sharp haircut, and the unmistakable expression of someone who lived to enforce pointless rules. "You've been warned multiple times, Mr. Walker," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace as she stared at his clothesline like it was an act of vandalism. "You have until the end of the week to remove it, or the fines will continue to increase." Jake folded his arms, leaning casually against the fence. "Let me get this straight. You're telling a rancher on his own land that he can't hang his own laundry." She sniffed, clearly unimpressed. "Rules are rules. If you don't comply, further action will be taken." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her pristine neighborhood, leaving Jake to stare after her, shaking his head. He glanced at the clothesline, then at the growing pile of fine notices he had tossed onto his porch table. A slow grin spread across his face. If they had a problem with his laundry before, they were really going to hate what he had planned next. Jake wasn't one for unnecessary conflict, but he also wasn't the type to roll over just because some overzealous HOA busybody decided to play sheriff on his land. If Margaret Simmons wanted a fight over something as harmless as a clothesline, then she was about to get one. The next morning, he drove into town, whistling to himself as he picked up supplies. He wasn't going to remove his clothesline. Oh no. He was going to give the HOA something really unsightly to complain about. By the time he returned to his ranch, another fine notice was waiting in his mailbox. $250. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head at the ridiculousness, as if he was going to pay them a dime. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Margaret reappeared, this time with two other HOA board members in tow, a wiry man with oversized glasses and a woman who looked permanently displeased. They stood at the edge of his fence like they were inspecting a crime scene. "Mr. Walker," Margaret called out, arms crossed, "you failed to comply with our request." Jake, who had been leisurely tossing hay to his horses, turned with an easy grin. "Oh, I got your request, just didn't much care for it." The wiry man cleared his throat. "The HOA has rules for a reason, sir. We strive to maintain a certain standard in our community." Jake snorted. "This ain't your community, pal. It's my ranch. Been here longer than your entire subdivision." Margaret's lips thinned into a tight line. "Nevertheless, as long as your property falls under HOA governance, you must comply." She pulled a crisp new envelope from her folder and held it out. "This is your final warning. Remove the clothesline by the end of the week, or legal action will be pursued." Jake took the envelope, but instead of opening it, he simply tucked it into his back pocket with a smirk. "Much appreciated, Margaret. You have yourself a nice day now." The HOA squad huffed, clearly irritated that he wasn't caving to their demands. As they stomped back toward their shiny SUVs, Jake watched them go, an idea already forming in his mind. They thought his clothesline was an eyesore. Well, he was about to give them something they really couldn't ignore. Jake got to work the very next morning. If the HOA was determined to fine him over a simple clothesline, then he was going to make sure every penny of those fines was put on full display. Literally. He took a drive into town and picked up several oversized white bedsheets, along with a few buckets of black paint. Back at the ranch, he spent the afternoon carefully painting each HOA fine in bold, thick letters across the sheets. He made sure they were legible from a good distance away, every ridiculous dollar amount, every pompous demand, every bureaucratic threat. By sundown, his work was done. He stood back and admired his masterpiece. Instead of his usual laundry, his clothesline now held massive white sheets, each one fluttering proudly in the breeze, covered in giant, unmistakable copies of his HOA fines. They stretched across his fence line like an art installation of petty injustice. Anyone driving past would get an eyeful of the HOA's absurdity. The next morning, Jake didn't have to wait long for a reaction. Margaret's SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of his property, kicking up a cloud of dust. She practically launched herself out of the driver's seat, her eyes wide with disbelief as she took in the spectacle before her. The sheets, the enormous painted fines, the absolute mockery of the HOA's authority. It was all too much. "What is this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the display. Jake, leaning casually against his fence with a cup of coffee, took a slow sip before answering. "That? Oh, that's just my laundry, Margaret. Thought I'd air out some of the nonsense you've been sending my way." Her face turned a shade of red that rivaled a ripe tomato. "This is outrageous. You cannot." "Actually, I can," Jake interrupted, tipping his hat back. "See, your little HOA rules mention unsightly clotheslines. Never said anything about what's hanging on M. Figured these fines deserved some fresh air." Margaret sputtered, clearly at a loss for words. Behind her, a few nosy neighbors from the HOA's pristine community had pulled up in their golf carts, whispering and pointing at the giant, fluttering sheets. The spectacle was impossible to ignore. Jake hid a grin. Oh, this was just getting started. Margaret looked like she was about to explode. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she turned to face Jake, nostrils flaring like an angry bull. "This is a violation of the HOA's policies," she barked. Jake tilted his head, pretending to consider her words. Funny, I read those policies real careful. Didn't see anything about displaying official HOA documentation being against the rules," he smirked. "Seems like I'm just helping you spread the word about all those fines you've been handing out." Behind her, the other HOA board members arrived, stepping out of their cars with expressions of mixed horror and embarrassment. They craned their necks to read the massive fines painted across the sheets, their own signatures and letterheads enlarged for the world to see. "This is a disgrace," Margaret hissed, spinning back toward Jake. "You are mocking the HOA." Jake took another leisurely sip of his coffee. "Margaret, I wouldn't say I'm mocking the HOA. I'd say I'm honoring it. Ain't this just transparency in action?" One of the board members, the wiry man from before, adjusted his glasses. We can take legal action," he stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. Jake chuckled. "Go ahead, take me to court over my laundry. I'd love to see a judge's face when they hear you're suing a rancher for hanging up the fines you sent him." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The growing crowd of neighbors watching from a distance only made things worse. Some had even started taking pictures. The HOA's precious reputation was crumbling faster than a dry biscuit in a rainstorm. Jake could see the gears turning in Margaret's head. She was furious, but she also knew she was backed into a corner. If she pushed too hard, this ridiculous story would spread like wildfire, and the HOA would be a laughingstock. "You haven't heard the last of this," she snapped, jabbing a finger in his direction before storming back toward her car. Jake gave her a lazy salute. "Lookin' forward to your next letter, Margaret." As she sped off, kicking up gravel, Jake turned back to admire his handiwork. The real fun was just beginning. He wasn't just going to annoy the HOA, he was going to make sure they regretted ever messing with him in the first place. Jake wasn't done, not by a long shot. The HOA had declared war over a simple clothesline, and if they thought they could bully him into submission, they had another thing coming. The next morning, he took things up a notch. With a little help from a few friends in town, he printed out extra copies of the fines, not just the ones they had sent him, but ones they had slapped on other folks in the neighborhood too. HOA violations for grass height, wrong mailbox color, even a seasonal flag displayed outside of approved holiday months. Every ridiculous fine they had ever handed out was now public record, and Jake made sure it was real public. He expanded his operation. Instead of just using his clothesline, he strung more lines across his front fence, draped a few sheets over hay bales, and even hung a particularly large one off the side of his barn. His property became a full-blown art exhibit of HOA absurdity. By mid-afternoon, people were stopping along the road, taking pictures and laughing at the sheer pettiness of it all. Even a local news reporter showed up, clearly entertained by the sight of a rancher fighting back with nothing but bed sheets and black paint. Jake was out fixing a fence post when he heard the unmistakable screech of tires on gravel. He turned just in time to see Margaret's SUV come to a jerking halt in front of his ranch. This time, she had an entire caravan of HOA board members with her, all red-faced and fuming. "You think this is funny?" Margaret seethed, storming up to him. Jake tipped his hat, grinning. "Margaret, I know it's funny." She gestured wildly at the giant fines flapping in the wind. This is defamation." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Defamation? Margaret, all I did was share your own words. You wrote the fines. You sent them out. I just gave him some fresh air." The wiry man with glasses spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "You need to take this down immediately. This is an act of public humiliation against the HOA." Jake scratched his chin. "You mean like how y'all tried to publicly humiliate me over my clothesline?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "That's different. We enforce standards. We're trying to keep property values high." Jake leaned against his fence, looking completely unbothered. "Well, Margaret, from what I've heard, folks round here think the biggest threat to their property values ain't a clothesline, it's you." A few passing cars honked, the drivers cheering as they slowed down to snap pictures. Margaret's eye twitched. Jake could see the panic creeping in. This was spiraling far beyond what she had expected. And he wasn't even done yet. Margaret stood there, fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The other HOA board members whispered among themselves, clearly horrified by the attention this was getting. But Jake, he was just getting comfortable. "You've made your point," Margaret snapped, her voice tight. "Now take it down, all of it." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, enjoying the way the afternoon breeze made the giant fines ripple behind him. "Now, see, I'd love to oblige," he drawled. "But the thing is, Margaret, I got a lot of laundry to air out, and folks seem real interested in reading what the HOA's been up to." Margaret practically vibrated with rage. "You are mocking the rules that keep this community respectable." Jake grinned. "Margaret, if the rules are respectable, why do they look so stupid when you see M out in the open?" The wiry board member stepped forward, waving a clipboard. "We are filing a formal complaint. You are in direct violation of HOA bylaws section." Jake held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let me stop you right there, pal. I got a lawyer buddy, real sharp guy, looked over all them bylaws for me. Turns out," he turned, gesturing at the massive fines flapping in the wind, "nowhere in your precious rulebook does it say I can't display official HOA documents on my own property." Margaret's eye twitched. That's implied. You can't just..." Jake tilted his head. "So let me get this straight. The HOA can send me hundreds of dollars in fines, but when I put those same fines on display, I'm the bad guy." He let out a low chuckle. "That don't sound like community spirit, Margaret. That sounds like you don't want folks knowing how much nonsense you're pulling." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, visibly struggling to find a comeback. And then the real kicker happened. A local news van pulled up, camera crew hopping out in a hurry. The reporter, a woman with a bright smile and a microphone, strode toward them, clearly amused. "Mr. Walker, we've been hearing about your creative response to your HOA fines. Would you be willing to comment on the situation?" Jake grinned. "Why, of course, always happy to talk about my laundry." Margaret's face drained of color as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just some petty dispute anymore. This was about to go public. Jake tipped his hat, giving Margaret a slow, knowing smile. "Checkmate." Margaret stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as the news camera zeroed in on her. The other HOA board members shuffled awkwardly, some stepping back like they wanted no part of this impending disaster. The reporter turned toward Jake, microphone in hand. "So, Mr. Walker, could you explain why you've turned your property into, well, a public exhibition of HOA fines?" Jake leaned against his fence, looking as relaxed as ever. "Well, ma'am, it started when the HOA decided my clothesline was too unsightly for their tastes. Next thing I know, I'm getting fine after fine, couple $100 just for drying my laundry the way folks have done for generations. So I figured, why not put those fines to good use? Let everyone see exactly what the HOA thinks is worth punishing." The reporter's eyes twinkled with amusement. "And these are all real fines?" "Oh, they're real all right," Jake said, gesturing toward the giant sheets. "Ain't nothing up there but the truth, straight from the HOA's own letters." The camera panned over the sheets, lingering on the bold, oversized fines. In the background, passing cars honked as people slowed down to gawk at the spectacle. Some even pulled over to take pictures, their laughter carrying through the open air. Margaret, now fully aware that she was being filmed, attempted to regain control. She stepped forward, forcing a stiff smile. "The HOA exists to maintain standards in the community. We enforce rules that homeowners agree to when they move in." The reporter turned to her. "And yet, Mr. Walker's home was here before the HOA existed, correct?" Margaret's eye twitched. That's not the point. He chose to live in a regulated community." Jake let out a laugh. "I chose to live on my ranch, Margaret. Y'all are the ones who decided to expand your little rule book where it don't belong." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "So, if the HOA rules don't specifically prohibit displaying their own fines, do they have any legal grounds to force Mr. Walker to take them down?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Well, that is," she sputtered, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. A voice from the growing crowd piped up. "Sounds like you don't like your own rules, Bane, exposed." Laughter followed, and Margaret's face turned bright red. Jake turned back to the reporter with an easy grin. "All I did was follow HOA policy, ma'am. I just made sure everyone else could see it, too." Margaret, realizing she was fighting a losing battle, spun on her heel. "This isn't over," she snapped before stomping toward her car. The other board members hesitated, but one by one they followed, looking thoroughly humiliated. As Margaret slammed her car door and sped off, Jake took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. The HOA had pushed him, threatened him, tried to bully him into submission. And now they were the ones running away. Their own rules turned against them. The fallout from Jake's art installation was swift and glorious. By the next morning, the HOA debacle had gone viral. Pictures of his giant, fine-covered sheets were all over social media, with captions like "HOA gets taste of its own medicine," and "Rancher finds genius way to fight back." The local news ran the story that night, and even a few national outlets picked it up, turning Margaret and her HOA cronies into the laughingstock of the internet. Jake sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching as more cars than usual slowed down in front of his ranch. Some folks waved, others just laughed and took pictures. Even a couple of his neighbors, previously too scared to speak up against the HOA, dropped by to shake his hand. "You did what we've all wanted to do for years," one man chuckled, tipping his hat. "That woman's been running this place like a dictatorship." A few days later, a brand new letter arrived in Jake's mailbox, but this time it wasn't a fine. It was an apology. The HOA had decided to review its policies on clotheslines and unfair fines. Translation: they were desperate to make the PR nightmare go away. Margaret had been forced to step down as HOA president, and rumor had it she was considering moving after the embarrassment. Jake smirked as he read the letter, then tossed it onto the growing pile of useless HOA paperwork on his table. He stood up, stretched, and walked over to his clothesline. With a satisfied sigh, he unpinned the sheets one by one, folding them neatly before setting them aside. His usual laundry, his worn flannels, jeans, and bedsheets, soon took their place, swaying peacefully in the breeze. And this time, no one dared to say a damn thing about it. With his land back to the way he liked it and the HOA put firmly in its place, Jake leaned against his fence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He hadn't just won a petty argument. He'd taught the HOA a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Some fights weren't worth backing down from, and if the HOA ever got any funny ideas again, well, he still had those sheets.